All right. Hello and welcome. I'm Andrew Ward, Professor of Management at Lehigh University and one of Lehigh's alternate representatives to the United Nations. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Lehigh University and International Labour Organization's panel discussion on how COVID-19 is reshaping the global workforce. We have people on the call from over 20 different countries joining us today. So this is truly a global discussion on the impact of this global pandemic. Lehigh has a strong partnership with the United Nations, being the 6th university in the world to obtain UN NGO accreditation back in 2004. In 2008, we established the world's first UN Youth Representative Program, where more than 100 Lehigh students have served as the voice of NGOs around the world, and many have made presentations at the UN. During normal times, we take students, faculty, and staff to the UN almost every week and often several times a week, and indeed have taken over 50,000 students, faculty, and staff to the UN since our partnership began. The partnership between Lehigh and the ILO has been active for nearly a decade, and many levels of collaboration, including hosting the ILO's 100th anniversary celebration and conference last April, the upcoming launch of the world's first model ILO, and today's presentation, which will be one of a series of similar events this fall. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Kevin CASSIDY, the Director of the International Labour Organization for the United States and representative to the Bretton Woods multilateral organizations in Canada, who will moderate our panel today. Kevin, over to you.
Professor Ward, thank you very much, and thank you to Lehigh University, the staff and faculty for working with us on this particular occasion, but as Andrew has indicated, we have a long history of collaboration. This particular webinar is a part of the partnership that we have. It is the first of a two-part series on the future of work. Critical conversations on the global workforce in the age of the coronavirus, how we're going to be reimagining the future workforce. And I don't think we can call it the post-pandemic world because unfortunately COVID-19 will be with us forever, and we will have to add to the mega drivers of change, pathogens and other health risks as well. As the world undergoes these sort of radical changes, the government leaders and employers and workers, as well as those who will be joining the workforce, will have to start looking at what are the skills that we need? What are the work environments we'll be in? How are we going to be able to respond in an effective way to the world in front of us? There were a number of challenges beforehand in looking at the digital economy and gig workers, looking at the change in demographics and the introduction of technology, which is changing our world of work. Today, we are going to be looking at a range of issues and also from specific national levels as well too. So this workshop will look at the valuation of essential workers and the protection of those workers. The ILO is a rights-based institution, and we wish for everyone to know that. Also, in terms of the gig environment and how the workforce will change, the skills that are necessary, and the ongoing skilling and reskilling and upskilling that is necessary, and also looking at the long-term business strategies for business continuity. To jump right into the discussions and mindful of everybody's time, we are going to break this into three presentations, and then we'll have a Q&A for 20 minutes, and then we'll ask the speakers to close with a final statement to those who are assembled here. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor CORINNE Post. Professor Post is a professor of management at the College of Business in Lehigh University. She has received her PhD in organizational management and her master's degree in international management and her bachelor's in organizational management. Prior to academia, Professor Post has worked for Accenture as an IT analyst and then as a human resource specialist. So without further ado, Professor Post, if I could ask you to kick us off here today. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And I thought I'd just start off by saying that as a professor of management, I'm actually most interested in the behavior of individual workers. So my lens, my vantage point, if you like, my perspective is that of mostly individual workers and the role of organizations and how they work within teams. I also come to the panel today with more of a US angle. I tend to have a foot or a toe or a few toes on the European side, so I'll bring some data points that I can there. And in my research, I'm mostly interested in diversity and inclusion, so that's also the lens again through which I see the world. And so among the various themes that are on the table today, two of them seemed especially interconnected and interesting to me. One of them, the two are the idea of the protection of vulnerable workers and valuation of essential workers, and how that connects to the virtual work environment. And clearly our work and personal lives have changed dramatically since the beginning of this pandemic. Initially for some, there was a reduction in work and a loss of jobs. But in other cases, for example, among healthcare workers, there was actually an increasing workload, longer shifts, working in more dangerous conditions for many employees, especially first responders or individuals working in retail, for example. And then also for those not necessarily in those dangerous conditions, just a radical change in how work is conducted. So think about physicians now doing tele-advising their patients, or entire educational institutions that just had to shift to working virtually and for jobs in which those customer interactions were really critical. Obviously, many of us, most of us, have learned to work a wide percentage of our time at home, sort of with whatever we could put our hands on to make it work, and with the absence of formal schooling as schools closed and went virtually as well. So a lot of concerns around worker safety, around how do we, improvise within this context and what does it mean? And how do we give people the competence, the ability, the confidence to perform their work? So it was interesting to see initially, I was looking at what some of the firms were doing in the US, and quite a few went out above and beyond what their responsibilities were. So in the US, we have OSHA, the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, that puts rules out as to what organizations need to do to protect their employees. They did put some new rules out as the pandemic unfolded, but they were very sort of broad and gave a lot of latitude to employers. Still, you did have large grocery stores that, for example, gave special time periods for their employees to their shopping first and get their needs met. You have large pharmacy in the US that also gave employees paid time off to take care for children, whether these were full-time workers or part-time employees. You had many organizations really jumping in and providing personal protective equipment to workers as well. So there was sort of this altruistic, very concerned behaviors from employers, and also among white-collar workers. McKinsey, for example, letting employees adjust their work schedule so that they could both take care of their kids and then maybe work later at night. So one big question clearly is whether or not this generosity is going to sustain itself, whether this care we felt for, or employers felt their employees deserved, is that going to be maintained or not? And this is particularly important because the people who are most negatively affected by these changes, by the loss of jobs, by the need to juggle work and family, and by the effects of the pandemic itself, of course, were women for the most part, and minorities or employees that are related to migrational trends. And so what have we seen? It looks like some of the unions have been able to secure some additional protections for their union members. I also noticed in Switzerland on the ballot in a few weeks is an initiative to have the minimum wage at 23 Swiss francs per person, which would be the highest a basic wage worldwide, and is the direct outcome of thinking about these essential workers. What is concerning, though, is that there is at the same time an increasing investment on the part of employers in artificial intelligence, So algorithms to figure out how they can best use and plug employees into the demands that their company has, as well as investments in technology and automation. So those are sort of some things there in the background. What's interesting to me is that the workers that were most protected seem to be those that were supporting white-collar workers that were engaging now in more virtual work. And at the same time, you have a whole sort of part of the economy that's falling apart because white-collar workers are no longer going physically into the office. So you have both sort of the support of these essential workers when they can enhance the ability of others, white-collar workers, to work remotely, and sort of the whole dropping of a whole segment of the economy that collapses because of that convergence towards more virtual work. So if we think about virtual work, it's funny, being a researcher who does research on gender, most of the employees who were able to work part-time prior to COVID, for most of those employees, it was something that they negotiated almost on an individual basis with their employers, right? So it was something you sort of had to make a business case for, why do I deserve part-time work or not? And often it was, you know, for 1 or 2 days a week. And the rationale was typically to be able to better balance work and family. For some firms, there were issues connected to maybe improving the environment or just sort of promoting behaviors that might be more environmentally friendly, but mostly it was something individually negotiated to help people manage work and life and family. Post-COVID-19, or as COVID-19 unfolded, it's sort of this involuntary reduction in time in the office for a wide swath of employees. Everybody went virtually for all the time. Many are still not back at work, and it was contemporaneous with the loss of childcare. So now suddenly it became just impossible to manage. So really large differences in what virtual work meant pre and not post. What are you saying? During COVID, I don't remember if you had a term for it, but as this unfolds, right? Now, multiple surveys, both in the US and in Europe, show that employees want to continue working remotely, want to telework. I think one of the surveys, multiple surveys in France show between 60% and 90% of people who are currently working remotely say, this is great, I want to keep going. Companies that had already some experience with virtual work, actually a good chunk of them, maybe a third, reported seeing productivity increases with the switch to virtual work. Surveys of human resource leaders in organizations, about 3/4 say, you know, telework is here to stay, and in quite, you know, sizable ways, not like it was pre-pandemic. There's some evidence, although it's not entirely clear, that it could also have a positive effect on climate change. So there certainly is a big sort of movement or force or gravitational pull towards more of this going forward. And again, I would stress, you know, as one is seeing an increased investment in digital efforts and increasing automation. And so there are a few, you know, I wish I had a presentation with a clear start and finish. This is where things start to become a little more messy. I think some interesting things to observe and to be attentive to is what is happening to our workspaces sort of geographically, right? So if you go to places like Wall Street, or if you go in the neighborhood of La Défense in Paris, and I'm sure City is the same, there's sort of dead neighborhoods, right, that were thriving at some point in time. And then you have many workers fleeing these urban centers and trying to want to live a nicer life somewhere else. So that's one point, I think, of concern. What does that mean for service workers or essential workers or more vulnerable workers in terms of moving in, out, and the location of service jobs? The other item that is also concerning is, despite these, at least some evidence that firms are thinking about what workers deserve in terms of safety, in terms of security in their jobs, in terms of salaries, there's an increasing investment in AE. And so what that means is that, for example, a firm like Starbucks is able to predict with quite quite high accuracy what their demand for coffee might be at any particular time of the day, depending on the weather, on traffic patterns, the day of the week, whatever else. And they're able to quickly let people know, you know, we don't actually need you today, or we need you to come in real quickly, so that it makes it very difficult for employees working in these firms to have any sort of control over their life. And so that is, I think, something of concern. Another potential area of concern and discussion is what are these skills that we will need in the future? So we know that teamwork, virtual teamwork isn't the same as it is in reality, but we don't quite know how and what the best teamwork skills are. So those are just a few points to sort of lay on the table, and I'll be happy to engage more with them afterwards. Thank you.
Great. Professor Post, thank you very much. At this time, I'd like to introduce my colleague, and thank you so much for staying up very late, calling in from Vietnam. Ms. Valentina BARUCCI is the Senior Labor Economist for the ILO office in Vietnam, a very dynamic country. Ms. BARUCCI will look at the recent economic journey of Vietnam, its structural transformations, the economic and social policies it's implemented, and the unique challenges that Vietnam faces as a middle-income country with a rather unique labor market. So, Valentina, if you would, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you very much for having me speak at this webinar on how COVID-19 is reshaping the global workforce. Look, I understand that this webinar is part of a series on the future of work, but I need to first take you to the past of Vietnam before we can talk about its future. This is probably valid for all countries, but in the case of Vietnam, certainly the aspirations and the ambitions of this country can only be fully understood if we really look at the achievements that the Vietnam has attained. So why don't we turn back the clock to 1975, 1976, upon unification of the country. So we are in Vietnam. We look around, what do we see? Well, we see the end of a devastating war. We see unemployment. We see poverty. We see the food shortages. And we see a state that keeps a very strong grip on an economy that is predominantly agrarian, right? Now, we bring back the clock to, say, pre-COVID-19 Vietnam, say 2019. At that point, Vietnam is aiming at becoming a high-income country within little more than 25 years. So something must have happened between these two moments. And what happened is what we call structural transformation. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with these words, you've heard them before. I really want to draw your attention on the fact that I'm not talking about change here. I'm talking about a country that transforms itself in the nature of its economy. And it was a deliberate process. It started in 1986 when the Communist Party introduced the Doi Moi, which means renewal. It was a set of policies to liberalize the economy and create what they called at that time a socialist-oriented market economy. And it worked. Almost instantly, actually. The private sector was born and started booming. Exports started growing. FDI came in, industrialization, urbanization, growth, and economic diversification and sophistication. For example, if you look at export composition in early 90s, almost 50% of exports were agricultural products, and basically coffee and rice. And then there was 1/3, which was basic textiles. Today, the share of agriculture in absolute terms, the volume of agricultural exports is a lot bigger than it was back then, but the share in relative terms has shrunk to 10%. And then we have electronics, 60%. Textiles is still around 20%. So we have machinery, we have wood and furniture. So you see the diversification of the economy. Now, why does this matter to the ILO? Because as the economy was being transformed, the labor market was transformed as well. And the labor market is interesting because it's about people, right? So if we look at the labor market, we have the opportunity to really see what economic transformation means in terms of impact on people's lives. So if we go back to the early 90s with that export composition that I mentioned before, if you had picked at that time randomly a worker from the labor market, you would probably have had 80% chances that that person was a farmer. You do that today, and you have 1/3 chances that person is a farmer, 1/3 that person works in a factory, and 1/3 that person works in services. And that applies to women and men alike. And women in Vietnam are almost as economically active as men are. Also, interestingly, if you pick again today randomly, you almost have 50% chances that that person is an employee. And it's interesting to think that in the early 90s, employees were found in public administration, basically, and that's it. Now, why is being an employee so important or so interesting? Because this is what we call in the ILO wage employment, and that is the type of employment that has the potential to be of good quality. This does not mean that all employees in the world have good quality jobs, but being an employee means that you have an attachment to an employer that gives you a certain stability. There is some level of agreement on how much you will be paid. If you're lucky, there will be pension contributions, there will be unemployment benefits coming with it. So potentially, that's a very good thing. Now, is it true that quality of employment has improved in Vietnam? Yes, it has. Over time, we have seen a slow but steady reduction in informality, for example. We have seen, especially over the last 10 years, that employment growth, so the jobs that have been growing are medium-skilled jobs and high-skilled jobs, whereas low-skilled jobs, growth there is almost zero. And usually, higher-skilled jobs are associated with higher pay and better working conditions. Now, it's not all good. There is a big but actually there, which is that social transformation has gone far, but not quite far enough. So economic prosperity has sort of created a dual labor market. On the one hand, you have the sexy jobs, the ones in the modern part of the economy, performed by people with stable jobs and the right qualifications for what they do. For example, last year, Vietnam started producing its fully Vietnamese car, right? So on the one hand, you have these engineers that have designed the Vietnamese engine. On the other hand, you have 70% of workers who are still in informal employment. On the one hand, you have one of the most internationally integrated economies in the world with a share of trade in GDP of more than 200%. On the other hand, if you actually look at what is the segment of this supply chains that is actually based in Vietnam, well, those are very low-skilled tasks that are performed. And I don't have to tell you that at that level, businesses compete on cost, right? And so the result is that the quality of those jobs is not very good. Now, COVID-19 might have been just the shock that Vietnam's leadership needed to begin to address that part of social transformation that has not yet been delivered by the economic growth. The way, the shape that the COVID-19 crisis has taken in Vietnam might be surprising to some of you because it's very different from what has happened in Europe or in North America. We almost did not have any health crisis at all. The government contained the spread of the virus really well. But we have had a very serious economic shock coming from the fact that all top export partners of Vietnam did have to deal with a very serious health crisis at home. And that has generated lockdowns and social distancing and all that you know. And as a result, the demand for Vietnamese products has collapsed. Now, the government reacted very quickly in early April, unveiled the package, which included cash transfers for people in informal employment who do not have access to unemployment benefits. Except that 3 months later, they had managed to disburse a little more than 10% of the whole amount that they had allocated on it. Because they realized that actually reaching these informal workers who are not working and who have been affected by COVID-19 was not that easy. And so they called us, and we are currently working with the government and with the Communist Party, actually, to understand what could be done to address the informal economy in Vietnam. So in a nutshell, the story that I'm trying to tell is that structural transformation has really changed the very nature of Vietnam's economy and what it means to work in this country. Social transformation has followed to a point, but now it really needs to be a policy choice. And I believe the COVID-19 has brought urgency and has pushed ahead this the materialization of this policy choice. So in Vietnam, adapting labor markets to post-COVID-19 does not really mean protecting workplaces and finding new working modalities. Even during the short lockdowns that we had, the share of people who had to work from home was less than 2%. So these are really not the issues here. However, post-COVID-19 labor market really means trying to make the fruits of economic transformation available to everybody and reducing the gap between the modern economy and the modern labor market and the old economy and the old labor market.
Great. Valentina, thank you very much. Are you pausing or are you continue finalized there?
I think I could stop here, or I could go on for another hour.
Yeah, I think we'll get to the dynamic interaction through the questions. Thank you very much, Valentina. I greatly appreciate that. At this time now, I would like to introduce my colleague, CHRISTOPH Ernst, who is recently been appointed the director ad interim for the ILO office in Buenos Aires, and has worked on as a senior specialist on employment issues and looking at the questions that governments face in terms of where to invest and to create employment. So, CHRISTOPH, the floor is yours, sir.
Hello, I couldn't hear you anymore. You can hear me well?
Sorry, I see that I was speaking to a mute mic. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. But CHRISTOPH, I was just introducing you. You are recently been appointed the director ad interim, and your work as an employment specialist and looking at advising governments on where to invest for sustainable job growth. So the floor is yours, sir. Please go ahead, CHRISTOPH.
Yeah, I couldn't hear you quite well. There's some problem with the connection. So, hello everybody. I want to explain a little bit the situation in Argentina. Argentina had maybe the longest and strict lockdown worldwide. It started mid-March, and since 2 weeks, for example, I can go out for a run. I couldn't go out before. We won't have any school this year. For the whole school year, there are almost no international and national flights, just repatriation flights since mid-March, extended, no time limit. Still, we have more new infected people every day per habitant than in the US or Brazil or any other country now. So not really success story. And that means we have a strong decline in economic growth, over 10% of production foreseen for this year. And even more, 11% around, according to our simulations, on employment, because most sectors who decline are labor intensive. And for example, tourism, construction, retail trade, and several manufacturing sectors. The expectations is that the economy could rebound in 2021 by about 8%. I think this is rather optimistic. Mostly the generation of new formal jobs has declined, in particular in specific sectors such as tourism, community services, retail, and some manufacturing sectors like textile and automobile industry. The employment protection legislations have been reinforced to avoid dismissals for unjustified reasons. A strong and fast reply by the government to counter economic recessions has taken place in a situation of very limited fiscal space. We just The country just negotiated its debt recently with the IMF. They had a debt default in May, but now we're on the better side, but still not resolved. And I don't know how can they finance the recovery in the future. They're stimulating measures for the economy and employment, public works and infrastructure, new credit lines, especially for basic inputs and medical supplies. We have support to enterprises, jobs and incomes. There's special financial support to micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, but which has not really been taken up. The rate is 10 to 20% only. There's a lot of social transfer programs. There's a special prohibition of dismissals and a support for essential activities. We have some other measures, for example, on the protection of workers in the workplace. We had the promotion of telework. There's a new law on telework, home office, which has just been started. There's special leave for workers at risk of infections and leave for workers with care responsibilities and workers belonging to risk groups. We have a paper on that also in English on the ILO website where you can see more on this. And there's a promotion of social dialogue also plays an important role. They created a tripartite committee to plan the gradual relaxation of the lockdown, and they want to start a new tripartite commission on the recovery from COVID. Some thoughts for all of us. How will the labor market look like at the end of the crisis? What is the impact on equality and the role of politics? We already have seen a rise in the poverty and extreme poverty in the country, the increase of unequal income distribution, and the increase of informality and also informal workers which have lost income. The pandemic crisis revealed the social and labor market problems countries face. In the case of Latin America, it's especially in the case of slums where you cannot stop contagion. It's almost impossible, where you have rates over 50% in the settlements, and I think at the end, in a couple of weeks, 100% will have the virus, and that's why we have so much spread over. Or let's say, for example, in Germany, you have the meat industry where they living conditions, or other countries where you have a bad public health system, and which then affects also the higher up population because you cannot contain the virus because of the national health system. So there's an urgency to fix the social labor market problem. Sometimes it's easier, like in Germany, where they introduced some new rules for the meat industry, but to fix the public health system or to fix a settlement problem, like in Latin America, it's not something which you can do from one day to another. We are still far away from a back to normal. How can we create a new and a better normality? What can we do on the question of inclusion of informal workers, the care workers, domestic workers, and what can we do about disability? I had a very interesting meeting with the private sector where they come up with a proposal. We need a new productive system of low proximity. We have to find a balance between health risk and economic risk. Also social or generational risk are related. Argentina is an economy of low distance, low level of home office we have in developing countries, so you cannot do, it's much more complicated. We have a high use of public transport. Many people rely on public transport, open settlements and higher urbanization. We have a low labor distance. We have the workspace which are often closed and badly aired. And we have a low use of sufficient hygiene measures at the workplace. We have a high level of informality and also a culture with low social distance. When people greet, they hug each other. We have a culture of drinking tea with a special straw, and you share it with the people. I don't know how they do it in the future, but these are all elements these are different, for example, to the Asian culture, where you have more distance and which also helps not to spread the virus. So we have also high proximity, low distance, for example, health and social services, low proximity in professional business services and communication. We are not that much exposed in our current jobs, but others, for example, also trade in manufacturing, transport, and agriculture, where you have a mid-level of proximity. And I think we have to look at the different sectors and how you can help them in their proximity, and then how to do this. 2 out of 10 Argentine workers may risk infection as they work either in closed rooms or rooms with bad ventilation. We have to integrate various elements in a Korean policy we have not thought of before. For example, it's a question of public transport. That's mostly why they closed the schools, and mostly why people cannot go to work. It's public transport, but it's also how to organize home office in this environment, infrastructure, schools and education, how you can do it at distance, the teaching, social protection, the working conditions, also the physical ones, are very key issues but we have to think of all these elements in an integrated way. Second element we are working on specifically, for example, a project on tourism, is the resilience towards future health or similar crises. We need a plan B to do production, to do consumption, for example, delivery. Now they open up a drive-in movie theater, which was maybe 30, 40 years ago, very popular. Now they have to redo this. Schooling, how to do homeschooling, sectoral plans, for example, as we work in tourism. So I think the resilience to live with the virus and what comes when we have to do another lockdown, we have to be prepared for that. That's very important. The last point, sure, obviously we can say maybe we go back to normal as we have progress in health and related issues, for example, better testing, tracing, they find a vaccine which works, viral drugs, and they have resolved this and also future health crisis. But it's not obvious that this will happen in a short time. And I think also plan A and B, we don't have to forget about it, yeah? What are the consequences for the future of work in Argentina? For example, they are thinking about it. There's a new legislation on telework. There's a rise of digital platforms as an alternative. And as Corinne also mentioned, also Argentina, artificial intelligence is increasing because there are lots of elements which are very useful. Now in the crisis with the development of vaccines, the tracing, the corona apps, etc. But there are all other elements which could facilitate our life to create the distance to work together. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Christoph, thank you very much. I think the benefit that we have today, and I want to get right into it, we have some wonderful questions coming in. We have the low middle income country of Vietnam, we have the high middle income country of Argentina, and we have the highly developed and high income country of the US. COVID-19 has impacted different jobs differently, high skills, low skills, informality. Some people can telework, some people cannot, and the different structures, the developing and developed countries. What is the data telling us about the world of work countries where you are doing your research, and what are some of the policy responses? I mean, we've heard some of that, but what are the policy responses you think will have the most effect in the countries and those specific examples? So if I can start with Valentina, and then Professor Post, and then to Christoph.
There, voila, okay. Thank you, Kevin. So yeah, as I said, let's approach it this way. So we can say that we have COVID impact on the labor market through direct channels and indirect channels. Direct channels are when a country has to impose policy to protect the lives and the health of their people, right? And that has an impact on jobs and incomes. Indirect channels is when other countries have to do that, and in this case, Vietnam receives basically the indirect impact of decisions made elsewhere. The direct channels in Vietnam are very limited, and they are limited to a 3-week period where non-essential businesses were closed. And at the moment, like Christoph said, here as well, borders are closed. So there is zero international tourism. All the rest is indirect channels of the type that I mentioned while I was speaking before, so through supply chains. Now, the impact, interestingly, we are working with the General Statistics Office, so we get the opportunity to see the data even before the Ministry of Labor does. And interestingly, so far, unemployment has increased very little. On the one hand, this is, of course, because companies are still trying to avoid layoffs. But on the other hand, that's also because people in general cannot afford being unemployed, right? Sitting around, remember here, a minority has access to unemployment benefits. So people try to get back into any income generating activity as quickly as possible. Rather, what we have observed is an exiting from the labor force, a kind of process, because in areas where there is no jobs available, then really there's no point looking for jobs, and there's no jobs to be performed. So people simply don't are basically idle for a period. And this is what we observe, for example, in cities where which cater for international tourism and are now literally ghost towns. There is nothing going on there. So there's no jobs for anybody. What the government is doing, honestly, not enough because they were very quick at unveiling that initial package that I mentioned, but since then, what in my view has been missing, and we have been communicating this message, is a review of the developments of the labor market over time and an adjustment of this initial package into something else. Rather, what they are doing, which is also not bad, they're taking this more medium to long-term view. For example, they're planning this high-level work on informality, but that will take maybe a year to be finalized or more, and years to come to fruition in terms of impact.
And Kevin, could you repeat that question or rephrase it, please?
Right. So the question was talking about the impact of COVID-19 on different jobs in different countries at different economic stages of development. And what is the data telling us about that? You know, some jobs can be telework, some cannot be. Some of the informal economy, which has less protections. So what is the data telling us about how, we're reaching the working public, and how can policy help them have continuity in their jobs?
So I'm not that much on the policy level, but I'll try here as best as I can. I think one of the areas that's been most striking in the US is the complete disconnect between what's happening on the educational side. So the school's decisions to open, to close, to do virtual school or not, with the question of who is looking after working from home, what happens to these children if they're not at home. So there's sort of a, the whole education sector is trying to figure out who should be coming to school or not, or working at home. Employers, for the most part, are expecting their workers to work, even if they're virtual workers, or if they're not, to be showing up. And there seems to be a real total void around a discussion of, well, how do we do this? How do we take care of that? So I wish I could say there was a solution, but I think I'm here, like with Valentina, sort of, there's certainly not enough discussions around that. There's some interesting work that some folks have been doing around figuring out, whether this means perhaps a shift towards more gig work for white collar workers. It seems like if a task can be done remotely, if there's maybe not a need for a direct moment-to-moment sort of finding a solution and implementing at the same time, and if one can communicate how to get these jobs done, that could be a risk here of potentially having some of these white-collar jobs becoming more of a gig economy. But I don't think that we're seeing that necessarily, or I'm not aware of data that's showing that that's happening on any sort of grand scale. So I hope this provides some fodder for that question.
It does. Christoph, from your experience and in Argentina?
I can not show a very rose picture in this regard. I think what is very key is public transport, because that's the major stumbling block, for example, to bring kids back to school in Argentina, and also bring people back to work. And I normally take an overly crowded train to go to work, and that's normal. And yeah, now it's full at 20%, and normally it's full at 150%. So I don't know how to fix it, but this is a very important stumbling block. And also the issue in Argentina, is in many other developing countries are facing that in Africa, is the fiscal space. The country doesn't have the funds to finance it. And also we have an inflation already before the crisis of 50%. Currently we have 50%. You cannot also finance it just printing money. That also doesn't fly. And we have the IMF like here, and there's nothing much to do. So my strategy, my advice always to the government is to spend better, because the country is a country which spends a lot on social protection, but not in a very efficient way. And sometimes you have to see how you can you make your spending more efficient, more targeted, and more productive as well. There was a quite, I looked at the chat, it was also very interesting. Maybe let's have a word on that. What are your thoughts on potential subsidizing the telecommunication industry, or trying trying to save industries, or use the time to help to get to develop new industry like marijuana industry, land conservation, etc. I also, that goes in the direction how to spend it better, and we are also trying to find solutions where to diversify more the economy, where to get more currencies, not to fall into the balance of payment problems like before, and how to get jobs for the unskilled workers. For example, one area which we promote also is on the green economy side, the circular economy. There are lots of inputs, yeah, what is called waste, but actually these are inputs, and they are often causing an environmental problem in Argentina. And the idea is to use it, because now there was also a decree recently, and that was cancelled again, to import recycled products when you already recycle 10% of what your products, of the products you have in the country, and the borders are closed. So the best thing is to fill the gap, to recycle what you have, and not to have an environmental problem. And there are various areas, there are waste pickers, and we can try to formalize, to improve their working conditions, to create a whole new economy with inputs you already have here, where you can get the inputs, the industry needs it. There's also the concept of industrial symbiosis in industrial parks. We also work on that. And to find new activities where we can find jobs for different types of workers, because we will have extreme poverty. So you really need jobs for people who are in the street, but these all what they are contributing in the value chain, they contribute also to people to work further up, and it's an input for the industries. So I think that's an important point. And in our case, as I said, it's more the question, the fiscal space is very limited. Let's try to change priorities. Let's try to be better and to be more effective. Thank you.
So speaking about that, I'd like to just talk about global supply chains and trade agreements and the like. We hope at the ILO, because we are a rights-based institution, that economic growth and social progress will go hand in hand. It's not always the case. COVID-19 has shown that we have been, for example, in the States, caught short by intermediate inputs. There are certain PPEs that we haven't had access to because the global supply chains are very diverse. Maybe Valentina, and then to the others as well too, how can free trade agreements help improve the situation rather than kind of coming back into our shell and reshoring or nearshoring?
I don't think it happens automatically. We have, this is a very, very interesting question. We have over the last few years, we have seen the emergence of a new type of free trade agreement, which we call new generation of free trade agreements. And they have specific chapters that are introduced so that to make sure that that the economic growth that is brought in by the free trade agreement is also sustainable. And with Vietnam, actually, the U.S. almost came into a CPTPP, a TPP at that time, trade agreement, which had a chapter on labor rights. And most recently, on the 1st of August this year, a new free trade agreement between Vietnam and the EU came into force. And that has a very strong chapter on sustainability, which requires Vietnam to ratify and implement all the fundamental conventions of the ILO. The fundamental conventions are 8 pieces of international legislation that are the foundation of international labor standards across the world: anti-discrimination, child labor, forced labor, and for the promotion of freedom of association and collective bargaining. And as an office, we were very heavily involved in the negotiations because as ILO, we were expected by the European Union to sort of assess the labor rights situation in Vietnam and basically recommend to them to go ahead or not. And what was interesting in my personal experience there was that I found myself having to help EU parliamentarians, so people who were born in countries where labor rights were already there when these individuals came to the world. All the set of fundamental rights were already there. How do you help them understand what a country looks like when those rights are maybe not there yet now, but are being built? How do you help them look at maybe we can even say, at the glass half full, but really how do new rights look like when they're being introduced in a society? It looks like we were convincing because in the end, the free trade agreement was signed by both sides. But to answer your question in a nutshell, I think it has to be deliberate, basically.
Corinne, could I turn to you on this and give it a gender angle? We know that women are losing their jobs at a greater rate than men, certainly those of color and those of lower economic scale. How can we build back better to ensure that the most vulnerable are not left behind? Your mic, please.
So how can we build better so the more vulnerable are not left behind? I would agree that having more protections for workers would certainly be a long way to go. And not just the protections, but then also the enforcement of those rights. Ultimately, what seems like what is happening in the United States is that organizations or corporations are taking charge or leading, obviously not all of them, but seem to be jumping in where policy might not be in existence. And clearly right now there's a lot of concern around anti-racism, for example, and I'm watching very carefully because we've been there before and organizations do not necessarily always follow what they say they're doing, but I'm very encouraged by the fact that I'm noticing these trends where, for example, around protections for employees who are sexual minorities came after fairly rapid changes in public opinions around whether being a sexual minority is acceptable or not, or gay marriage is acceptable or not. And as I'm looking at the changes in the percentage, especially of whites in the United States that believe that racism exists and discrimination exists, those numbers have increased very drastically over the last 15 or so years. And so to me, this signals that there is going to be a fairly radical or rapid change. Maybe it's the hopeful part of me, but I think that organizations tend to be sort of in sync with what people are looking for, believe is right, and in their efforts to retain talent, will put into place policies that look at this much more carefully.
Great. Christoph, I'm going to throw you that, plus I'm going to add the issue of skills. This is very important to most of the people who are here on this call. What is the difference of the skills, or what are the skills that are necessary for the future of work? How are companies investing in that? How are universities, in discussion with those companies, investing in developing the talent pipeline for the future?
I would have liked also the two other questions. I would have played the devil's advocate on the trade issue, you know, because it's a very closed country here in Argentina. And okay, let's start discussing more the skills issue. We have seen that the skills requirement are quite drastically changing in our times now. There's less need, for example, for the routine tasks, the manual tasks. Okay, in some niches, yes, but there's more need for non-routine tasks, for creativity, for social services, empathy, emotional intelligence, all the elements computers, robots, artificial intelligence cannot do so far. But it will come. So the way of teaching has to change. We have to get away from the pure learning. Yeah, it's just more to problem resolving. It's much more important to work in groups and to see this social interaction and to develop these social competencies. There are new technologies emerging, and there's a new paradigm of production and consumption, more towards a healthy, a green economy, which also needs to new technical challenges and challenges also in how to create jobs. Yeah, the situation is also quite different from a developing country like Argentina and the developed world. Obviously, they are all jobs with new tasks. Sometimes it's just a substitution or transformation of existing jobs. Sometimes there are brand new categories of jobs. And the characteristics of each job will change during the working age. It's not like before you have one job, you're an engineer, you're an accountant, you start and 30 years later you leave and you did all the way the same job. So there's much more changes in the task, and the people have much more to adjust to that. So what matters much more is lifelong learning, which we have to see how to integrate, how to create this, how to share the cost of this lifelong learning, who pays for it. Yeah, and we have to see, is it the government, are these the enterprises, the consumer, the people who are taught, they have to pay for it, and sometimes it's not that clear. And there's also we also have to create awareness of the usefulness of this lifelong learning. We have it similar small stuff, but ad hoc, but not as a way of learning, that this is lifelong learning. Yeah, it's a big challenge in a country like Argentina, where you have a large number of micro and small enterprises and a large informal economy. Here also we have to see how to reform the professional training system to face these challenges. For example, one major problem in Argentina is to standardize training, professional training nationally. Also, that would help to increase productivity. And I think that's one aspect is very important, the tripartite consultation on these issues and social dialogue. And there's just been created a new tripartite commission on professional training, and we are part of it. For example, it's very interesting in Argentina, trade unions are very strong in professional training, and enterprises are much disconnected from this. And I think it should almost be the opposite, because enterprises know what kind of workers they would need in the future, and then trade unions could be supportive to that. I see new opportunities, for example, in Argentina in the area of the knowledge economy, which is increasing. And also some studies have shown that there are lots of linkages, for example, to the knowledge economy. But I think that's a general trend worldwide, but also in Argentina specifically, there are some opportunities which are less so in other countries in Latin America, for example. But let me stop here.
Great. I think we have gotten very close to the end of this session. What I would like to do before we close and this session closes us out, if I could ask the speakers in reverse order, Christoph, Valentina, and Professor Post, just to give us a sort of 30-second to 1 minute kind of summation of what the final thought do you want to leave our viewers with today. Over. So Valentina, please. Sorry, Christoph first. My apologies.
I think the pandemic has shown us that the challenges are enormous. The labor market is changing, and maybe the trends in the labor market have been reinforced by the crisis. And I think we can learn from each other, from different developing countries, different level of development. I think we can learn from each other. I think these kind of exchanges are very good inspiration to learn and also to apply it in our respective countries. Thanks.
Right, Valentina.
Thank you, Kevin. I was actually thinking of leaving you with a positive thought, also inspired by what Corinne said before. I've had the opportunity to sit in this country and really study and watch and even be part of its change. And I want to agree with Corinne that institutions adapt to have no other way but adapting to what society wants. And Vietnam has been following this path to a point, and I'm sitting here watching with interest to see how far they will go. For sure, what they can teach us, and here I agree with Christoph, what they can teach us is the incredible optimism that this country has. There's no excuses, we keep going, and everything will be fine at the end. So I think this is a thought that in times of COVID is helpful for all of us, no matter where we are sitting right now. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Corinne.
Yes, and I would add, I think what's been fascinating to see is that in organizations we have routines. We have figured out how we do things to be effective. And when the pandemic hit, everything went out the window. And we all, or at least many workers, had to improvise with what they had. And so a big question is, how do we go back to before, right? I think you've already hinted to this. There's no real before. And so the question may be more, what have we learned? What have we learned about the relative quality or worth of different tasks in our jobs, of different jobs or different work of different people in our communities? What have we learned about the purpose of the workplace? What's the point of going to work in a physical location? You know, what's the value of integrating or separating work and family? And I think there are a lot of discussions, I see them certainly in Europe around, you know, how do we want to redefine, use this moment to redefine what work means, what it should be, and how it could be better.
Thank you very much. A fascinating discussion. I wish I knew some of this before I signed my 13-year lease for my office here. But thank you so much to Corinne Post, to Valentina BARUCCI, and to Christoph Ernst, and of course to the Lehigh staff. Andrew, I'll give you the last word. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Okay, thanks very much, Kevin. And again, thank you for such an informative panel. And we could do this for at least another hour. We just seem to be scratching the surface, but we do thank Kevin and Corinne and Valentina and Christoph for their insights today. Just to let everybody know, this panel was recorded and it's accessible if you would like to see it again, and it can be accessible at ilo.org/Washington or global.lehigh.edu/related-events, and there's a link to that in the chat. There are going to be more of these, more upcoming Lehigh ILO panels coming up this fall. The next one will be on gender issues, and so look for an email as to when that will be. But next week, on Tuesday, September 15th, from 12 to 1 Eastern Standard Time, Lehigh, along with Bridges 2030 and the Jordanian Ministry of Statistics, is also doing another workshop on open source tools and capacity building to impact the Sustainable Development Goals. And that you can also get registration through that link, the global.lehigh.edu link in the chat. So thank you everyone for joining us. Your participation is what makes these events, and thank you for all your questions. I know that there were many questions that were coming in to the chat to myself and to Bill, which we were feeding through to Kevin, but we didn't have time to get to them, and again, that would have been in the next hour or two. But thank you very much for joining us today.